The scream echoed through the quiet Wichita neighborhood. It was the kind of scream that froze the blood of anyone who heard it. A family had been found bound with ropes, lifeless in their own home. Police rushed in, stunned by the chilling sight. This was no ordinary crime. The killer had left his mark, tying his victims in a cruel way that showed he had planned every second. People in the neighborhood whispered in fear, wondering how such horror could happen right next door. But the real shock was still to come, because the man behind it all was someone they trusted. In the heart of Kansas, life in Wichita was slow and peaceful. Families went to church on Sundays, neighbors shared barbecues, and kids played in the yards until the streetlights came on. Everyone believed their community was safe. Among them was Dennis Rader, a man who looked like a model citizen. He was a church leader, the president of his local council, and even worked as a compliance officer. People waved to him on the street, never suspecting he carried dark secrets. Behind his polite smile and neat glasses, Dennis lived a double life. At home, he was a husband and father, mowing his lawn and helping his children with school. But deep inside, he carried violent desires he couldn't control. He called himself BTK, short for bind, torture, kill. The name alone sent shivers down spines, though no one yet knew it was him. The first known attack came in January 1974, when the Otero family was brutally killed inside their Wichita home. A father, a mother, and 2 children were found lifeless, their bodies tied with cords. The crime shook the entire town. Newspapers printed the shocking story, and police launched a massive search for the monster responsible. But the trail was cold, no fingerprints, no clear evidence, just fear that spread like wildfire. While investigators struggled, Dennis Rader carried on as if nothing happened. He still went to church, smiling at friends and shaking hands. He still clocked in at work, taking notes and following rules. No one suspected him. That was his greatest disguise. He looked so ordinary, so normal. He was the guy next door. Months later, another victim was found in Wichita. The crime scene had the same cruel pattern: bindings, control, and a chilling lack of mercy. Police realized they were dealing with a serial killer, yet the community couldn't connect the dots. How could such evil exist among them? People began locking their doors, installing new bolts, and watching their backs. Fear grew, and trust disappeared. Dennis felt powerful. To him, each crime was like a game of cat and mouse with the police. But it wasn't enough to kill. He wanted credit. He began sending letters to newspapers and law enforcement, bragging about his crimes. In these letters, he gave himself the name BTK and described details only the killer could know. His words were cold and mocking, as if he enjoyed making the city live in terror. The letters made headlines across Kansas. Suddenly, the BTK Killer was no longer just a mystery. He was real, taunting, and close. Parents kept their kids inside. Women looked over their shoulders at night. Police worked day and night, but every lead slipped away. Rader was careful, organized, and always one step ahead. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Dennis blended into normal life. He raised his children, kept his job, and gained respect in his church. People who knew him thought he was just another hard-working man. But behind closed doors, he collected trophies from his victims: photos, personal items, and notes. These objects kept his dark desires alive. For years, he lived undetected, hiding in plain sight. Then, in the early 2000s, Wichita grew quiet. BTK had not been heard from in years, and many believed he had either died or disappeared. Life slowly returned to normal. But in 2004, a new letter arrived at a local newspaper. The message was filled with chilling words, proving the BTK Killer was still alive. Inside the envelope was a photo of one of his old victims, along with details no one else could know. The killer had returned, and the city was about to face terror once again. The city of Wichita was in shock. After years of silence, the BTK Killer had spoken again. The 2004 letter was more than just a reminder of his past crimes. It was a threat. The chilling words and photos proved he was still alive, still watching, and still dangerous. Police scrambled to find clues, but fear spread faster than answers. People who once thought the nightmare was over now slept with lights on, wondering if BTK would strike again. Detectives pored over the letter, desperate for leads. It was written in a strange style, filled with puzzles and coded words. The killer wanted attention, and he wanted control. Experts said he seemed proud of outsmarting police for so long. The FBI joined the hunt, but Rader's identity remained a mystery. He was still the faceless murderer next door who blended into the crowd. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader was living his normal life. He was still married, still active in his church, and still working as a compliance officer. Neighbors described him as strict but helpful. No one suspected the man who walked his dog down the street was the same person terrorizing the entire city. That was his power. He hid in plain sight. But Rader grew restless. He craved more attention. He began sending more packages and letters, dropping them off in random places like libraries and mailboxes. Inside were photos, crime scene details, and even items belonging to his victims. Each delivery sent a wave of terror through Wichita. The killer was not just remembering his crimes, he was reliving them. Police formed a special task force, working day and night to stop him. They begged the public for help, but every tip led to a dead end. Technology had improved since the 1970s, but BTK was careful. He avoided leaving fingerprints and kept his face hidden. Still, detectives believed he would eventually make a mistake. They just had to wait. In 2005, Rader sent another package to a local TV station. Inside was a curious question. He asked if he could send information on a computer floppy disk without being traced. He wanted to keep playing his game, but he didn't want to risk capture. Police cleverly responded in the newspaper, pretending they couldn't trace it. Confident and arrogant, Rader sent a disk. That single mistake would seal his fate. Forensic experts analyzed the floppy disk and discovered hidden computer data. To their surprise, it led back to a church computer in Wichita. The files even had the name Dennis Rader embedded in them. Investigators couldn't believe it. Could this ordinary church leader really be BTK? They needed more proof, but the pieces were falling into place. Detectives quietly began watching Dennis. They followed him to work, to church, and even to the grocery store. He seemed calm, polite, and boring, exactly the opposite of a killer. But DNA evidence was the final test. Police secretly obtained a sample from his daughter's medical records and compared it with evidence from BTK crime scenes. The results were undeniable. Dennis Rader was the BTK killer. On February 25, 2005, police made their move. They pulled Rader over while he was driving near his home. He looked confused at first, then strangely calm. As officers cuffed him, he whispered, "I guess it's me." The community that once trusted him was stunned. The church leader, the family man, the neighbor. They had been living beside a serial killer for 30 years. In the interrogation room, Dennis Rader shocked detectives again. Instead of denying the crimes, he bragged about them. He described in chilling detail how he planned, hunted, and killed his victims. He explained his BTK code, smiling as if telling stories from a diary. The calm way he spoke made it even more terrifying. The murderer next door had finally been unmasked, but his words revealed something even darker, something the public would struggle to forget. When Dennis Rader finally stood before the court, the mask of a normal man was gone. The world now saw him for who he truly was, the BTK killer. He pled guilty to 10 murders, each one described in chilling detail. The judge, the jury, and even the families of his victims sat frozen as Rader spoke so calmly about the terrible things he had done. There was no emotion in his voice, only pride in the way he had tricked everyone for 3 decades. In August 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. For the rest of his life, he would sit behind bars, never again free to walk the streets of Wichita. The courtroom let out a sigh of relief. The man who once terrorized an entire city was finally locked away. But for many families, the wounds could never fully heal. They had lost loved ones to a neighbor they once trusted, and no sentence could bring those lives back. The story of Dennis Rader remains one of the most chilling reminders of how evil can hide in plain sight. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He was the church leader, the family man, the person next door who smiled and waved. His crimes taught investigators and the world that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear the mask of normal life. Today, the name BTK still haunts Wichita. The houses he once drove past, the people he once greeted, all carry the memory of fear. His capture brought justice, but also a lasting warning. Trust can be dangerous, and appearances can deceive. Dennis Rader's story is not just about the horror of his crimes. It is about the fragility of safety, the strength of persistence, and the courage of those who refused to give up until he was caught. The murderer next door had finally been unmasked, but his legacy lives on as a dark chapter in American crime history, a chapter we must never forget.